Yogananda couldn't become a citizen, even though he lived here for 30 years. He finally became a citizen the last couple of years of his life because the laws changed. He was a subject of a British Empire. They were spying on him. This is another thing we don't know, people don't realize. But the British were keeping an eye on him. They were opening letters clandestinely that were coming to see who was he writing for. Is he one of these radicals who was trying to overthrow the empire?
Hmm.
He spoke out. He spoke out in favor of Indian independence and for Gandhi. That was highly risky, but he did it.
What's up, guys? Welcome back to another episode of Your Superior Self. Today, I'm here with Phil Goldberg, author of the biography of Yogananda, not the autobiography, but the biography of Yogananda, right? Phil, thank you for taking the time.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Sure. Now, it seems like the biggest question here is, right, and I've heard you ask or say this in your talks, why write a book, a biography, when there's already an autobiography of Yogananda? So let's start off with that, right? Like, why the biography?
In 2010, I published a book called American Veda. Subtitle was From Emerson and the Beatles to Yoga and Meditation, How Eastern Spirituality Changed the West. So that's a comprehensive history of how India's spiritual teachings came here and transformed so many people's lives, including my own. In that context, Yogananda was one of the two or three most important of the teachers who came from the U.S., to the U.S. from India, and the first one to make the U.S. his home for most of his adult life. So his impact, largely through his autobiography of Yogi, but also, of course, all of his other work and the institutions he established, I devoted a chapter to. But in profiling, I profiled many of the teachers, and I got fascinated by his personal life because we don't know much about the personal lives of many spiritual teachers who become renunciates and monastics. They don't talk about themselves, but he did. So it was an interesting life. And after American Veda came out and was well received, I was asked to do a biography of a couple of the teachers, the gurus I profile. And I was not interested. But so I thought, well, what about Yogananda? Well, there's the autobiography. And I remember, because I had read the autobiography several times at that point and had looked into his life, and I realized how much he'd left out of his own book. It's called famously Autobiography of a Yogi, but most of the book's about other people and other things. And so I went back and reread it and did a page count. And it turns out that less than 10% of Autobiography of a Yogi is about his life after he comes to America, where he did all of his work and became famous and everything. And so I thought, well, there's a lot left out. And for example, there was one sentence that's really stood out. He came to the U.S. in 1920, and he arrived in Boston. And he stayed in Boston for 4 years. And in his autobiography, it says something like, and 3 more years passed in Boston. And I thought, no, he's leaving out a lot. And then he left out a lot about other periods of his time, especially here. So I thought, well, he made those choices. But there's a lot of interesting stories to tell and a lot of information about him and his impact that didn't make it into his own book. And plus, you can offer historical perspective that he couldn't possibly offer because he died 6 years after writing his book. And so you have all these more than half a century of history subsequently. And he couldn't put his own period of time in a historical context. That you have to do, after the passage of time. So that's why I wrote it. And it turned out to be a lot more interesting than even I thought it would be. So,
Oh, the curiosity's fired up right now. How did you do the research? How did you conduct it? Right? Was it old letters? Was it newspaper clippings? Like, what did that look like, and how did that
both
unfold?
both of those, I did a lot of newspaper digging. The Self-Realization Fellowship was cooperative. They have uh, the archive of everything Yogananda, and they were forthcoming about a lot of information and resources selectively. They didn't just open the door to the archive for me, and but they were very cooperative in answering my questions and providing me with documents. There were other books. People who knew him wrote about him. Some of his direct disciples had written memoirs. And so I drew from those. And there were unpublished letters that I had access to. Other people who didn't publish books, but who were curious about his life, had gathered material, people who knew people who were disciples. Once you get started on something like this, one thing leads to another. There were lawsuits having to do with Yogananda and after his death with SRF. So there were lawyers who gathered documents. There were court documents you could find, newspaper archives and the like. So that's basically it. Plus, I went to India. I went to his, the places he lived, and that sort of thing.
Mm. What did his book do for you? Right? Like, were you already on that path spiritually, or was this like I
Well,
think, yeah? What did that look like?
it's interesting. I My spiritual path began in the late 1960s when I was young, and I had already done a lot of study on Vedanta philosophy, yoga philosophy, Buddhism, all that stuff. It was in the air, and I ate it up. And I had already uh, begun a meditation practice that had changed my life, that I was deeply committed to. I was going to train to become a teacher in that lineage. Autobiography of a Yogi launched a lot of people's spiritual paths. That was the introduction to certain teachings for many, many people. It wasn't for me. I was already, fairly well informed. And then I read that, and it was another important resource in my own development. So Yogananda never became my guru. I never became a student of his work in a formal sense or a disciple, but he was what in India is called an upaguru, a guru who you learn from, who's not the guru, but one that you learn from and who has important things to teach you. And he was that for me. And, I learned new things from reading Autobiography of Yogi that I hadn't learned before. Plus, I got a glimpse of life in India firsthand, from Yogananda. At that kind of deepened my fascination with India as a culture and as the storehouse of ancient wisdom, and sort of whet my appetite for more. So it was important. I can right here is this is the copy
Oh
I
wow.
read. This is 1970. I read this edition.
Oh wow. That's
I
awesome.
was a young quasi hippie living in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and I still have it. This is, what, 53 years later. I moved, 15 times in the 70s and 80s. And, I moved from to the West Coast. I moved back to the East Coast. I moved to the West Coast. Now I'm back on the East Coast. This book is still with me. It survived all the packing and unpacking. And you can see on the flap that it cost $5, this big, thick hardcover. And I wouldn't have had $5 in 1970 to buy a hardcover book. And so I probably borrowed it because it
Air
was being
quotes.
passed around in
Borrowed it.
certain circles. And I never paid it. I never returned it. So whoever I borrowed it from, I'm grateful to. And I always like to say I've written so much about Yogananda and spoken about him so much to work off the karma of ripping off someone's book.
Well, I don't think we find books. I think books find us.
Yes, it found me.
Sure. Do you think Yogananda's book is still relevant today?
I'm teaching a course in it as we speak.
Really?
And, people still finding it relevant. It still sells thousands of copies a year in one edition or another. It's in more than 50 languages. And people, like the people in the course I'm teaching, some of them are reading it for the first time, having heard about it over the years in some cases, or maybe, some cases hearing about it new uh, uh, recently. But some people are in the course rereading it because they want to dive deeper into it, and or they read it years ago and their lives have changed. So it's fascinating. And I've read it now, I don't know, 10, 12 times for my own sake in early days, and then for professional reasons, doing research on books and things. And now I'm teaching a course in it, so I have to revisit it again. And I keep learning new things.
Sure. I mean, when
And
I
then
read
they
it,
read my book, whose title is The Life of Yogananda, and supplement what's in Autobiography of a Yogi. So it's somehow he and I have a karmic bond that I'm very happy about.
sure. Speaking to that karmic bond, there's a lot of teachings in the book that refer back to India's culture, right? And a lot of the teachers that he came across in his path had siddhis or special powers, and I just read them for face value, right? At the very beginning, the
Mm-hmm.
first time that I read them, like the Tiger Swami. I'm like, this guy can wrestle tigers? Like, what's going on here? And he's okay. Like, but then as you get into it metaphorically, you start seeing ideas and concepts pop up that have more meaning than that, than face value, like the tigers that we face every day, like
Yeah.
the mind, the thoughts. And then it started clicking for me. The levitating saint. I don't know if I have anything going on in my life that's metaphorically levitating, but I can relate to the tiger situation. Every day I battle tigers with negative thoughts, or just living a life as a householder in this culture, right? Not being a renunciate, not being an ascetic, just kind of living my life, doing meditation practices and going out into the world and living in this culture that we live in the materialistic society. There are tigers associated with that. Also, I really resonated with Yogananda and him trying to leave to go to the Himalayas, right? Like running
Mm-hmm.
away from that. And
Yeah.
I can kind of see where all of his gurus and teachers were like, no, you got to stay here, because like you're the example, right? He wrote this book to show us that you don't need to run to the Himalayas. You don't need to run into a cave and meditate for 30, 40 years. Like this is the hardest thing. Can you sit in the fire of Western society and meditate and do yoga and live your life and not be judgmental on the things, not be judgmental of the tigers that attack you every day, right? But go out, be proactive in your development spiritually, and just every day confront those tigers and just keep pushing forward.
Yes. Yes to all that. Let's tackle the cities, the so-called miracles first, since you brought it up. It's often the first thing people want to talk about. I often say there's two kinds of people who are fans of autobiography of a yogi. People who really want to read about those superpowers and miraculous things that the yogis he writes about have done and can do. And people who think it's all hogwash and they love the book anyway. Mm-hmm. And to them, the miracles are just things they gloss over or just read as if it were a good novel. And some people are really interested in that stuff. So it's very interesting. I often wondered, and like you, I approach things originally, of course, with great skepticism, but also great fascination, because the message was not lost on me, even early on, that even if his stories are exaggerated, even if some of the stories he was not witness to, but heard about, were fables. Fine, maybe that's the case. But maybe some of it is true, or even all of it is true. What are we talking about here? We're talking about the capacity of human consciousness when it's in advanced states. So I was open to the possibility that the mind has capacities most of us don't tap. And I had evidence for that in the fact that in my, or even early on, after months and a couple of years of meditation at that point, my brain had changed, my mind had changed, my consciousness had changed. There was little shifts you could see. It's not that I was doing miraculous things, but my mind was clearer. My intuition was sharper. My intellect was more capable. So if you extrapolate and say, oh, consciousness can change, well, what if you keep growing, keep advancing? Maybe then some of these things become possible. And maybe for people living at a different time in a different culture, when it was less pure and we were, the air was less polluted and there was less stress and strain on us, people's minds in advanced cases could do miraculous things. And there's evidence for that in the literature. And there were, people who were said to be psychics and all that. So I was open to the possibilities of advanced human consciousness. Being in two places at once, levitating, I wasn't so sure. And to this day, I can't say, I'm convinced or that there's evidence for it. But I don't discount the possibilities, even if they're only rare, the rare person once in a while who could do those things. They're if there are rare people who could do those things, then even I and even you can do something approximating that. And some of those things are very practical.
Hmm.
So that's how I always took it. If people can know what's going on at a distance, if people can see into the mind of another person and help them because they have that ability, then my intuition could be better. I wrote a book about intuition. It was one of my early books in the 1980s. Because of things like this, I became fascinated with it. So my having a good hunch or my having a feeling about somebody is in the same category. It's like, I'm not Michael Jordan, but I can shoot a foul shot better than, if I worked at it. Right. So
Sure.
we have these capacities. Um, and I thought of them in those ways. But to come back to why did he do it is the question. Why did he include so much of that? And I wondered about it. And I wondered, was he just trying, people are very cynical. Oh, he's just, it's making up stories to sell books. I knew enough about Yogananda's life to know that's not why he did that. So I was interviewing one of my sources in doing my research, as I said, were the people at SRF, Self-Realization Fellowship. And then my main liaison at the time, the person who's was understood to be the sort of SRF historian, the one who had access to all the archives and everything, is now the president. But at the time he wasn't. He was a high rank, one of the leaders of the. And I asked him one day, I said, why did he do that? Why all that? He said, it's in the book why he did it. You have to, do you see it? And this book's been with me a long time and I never noticed on what's called the title page where, inside, not the copyright page, but the title page where you see autobiography of Yogi, blah, blah, blah. There's a little quote from the Bible, from John 4:48, except ye see signs and wonders, you will not believe. And I thought, oh my God, he put that in there at the very beginning of the book before you even read a word of his. He was telling us why he did that. Because some people need to see these so-called miraculous stories. That's how teachers, not just him, not just in a book, but that's often how people get your attention.
Sure. Kind of wake you up, right? Kind of like a
Yeah,
slap in the face.
look,
Wake up.
these things are possible. You too can do these things. You too can have these spiritual gifts.
Somebody famous said
Maybe
that.
not to the extent of the people I'm showing you, but as I already said, to the extent you can. Your consciousness, our consciousness, human consciousness, is capable of extraordinary things. And if in your life that just means you have more love and compassion and insight and clarity and goodness, that too is a miracle.
What I love about it, right? Like he kind of foretold like what our reality is, right? Like there's all these theories now about simulation theory, and they're actually the what is it, Nobel Peace Prize for Physics last year or 2022, I think it was. There's three of them. I don't remember their names, but they received the award for possibly, or I should say possibly, but proving that local realism is false, right? So And Yogananda in his book states that this is a play. This is a drama.
Right.
What does that mean to you? Right? Like, what is this reality? If we're finding out now that this is really the mind of the creator, like, what does that mean?
There was a famous physicist back in the early first half of the 20th century who famously said, and I can't remember the exact quote, this was the beginning of the age of quantum physics, when they penetrating the very small, what's going on the subatomic level, and quantum physics came out of that with all of its mysteries and wonders. If you look at physics in its current iteration, subatomic physics, the world is non-material. The world is fundamentally vibration, waves, and they're called particles, but they're not particles. They're waves of energy. And so this book we've been looking on, this table, this chair I'm sitting on, my body, it's energy waves that congeal in certain ways. And this is pure physics. This is not metaphysics. And so what that physicist I mentioned said at that time, the universe begins to look like a giant thought. And I remember reading that and thinking, oh, it's in the days when we said, oh, wow. that's incredible. Well, what's one of the interesting things about the transmission of these ancient Indian insights into life and existence, as they've been translated into English and as they came across the globe to the Western world and influenced all our lives, one of the extraordinary things about that is they've never been inconsistent with science. Science progresses, science evolves, and these teachings remain more verifiable in a sense, whereas a lot of religious teachings just disappear in the face of scientific evidence. Certain views of history, archaeology, all these things make this split between science and religion irreconcilable. But with the metaphysics of the East, which we think of as religious, but can also be understood as a science of consciousness. And as Yogananda's first speech when he came to America was the science of religion. Mm-hmm. There was always, and his predecessors, like the great teacher Swami Vivekananda, and the gurus who came after him, they were always fascinated by science. The Dalai Lama he meets with scientists all the time. So did Yogananda, so did subsequent gurus. Vivekananda was a pal of Tesla's, not the car, the scientist, and this is because these teachings have verifiable empirical evidence to support them. And they were never presented to us as a religion you have to convert to. They were yoga and Vedanta philosophy, and they were presented by teachers like Yogananda as insights with practical application that you can take into your life, and you don't have to convert from your own religion. You don't even have to believe in anything. You just have to, be adventurous enough to open your mind and try these things out. So the many, many famous Western physicists were studying the Bhagavad Gita and other sources to amplify their own discoveries. one of them is now the subject of a major motion picture. Oppenheimer. Oppenheimer was a student of these teachings, and so was Erwin Schrödinger and Werner Heisenberg and so many others. So the compatibility of Eastern teachings, of yoga, you could say, Hinduism and Buddhism, with science has been a feature ever since, the two cultures came together. And here we are in a world where physicists tell us that just as these ancients who spoke the Upanishads and the Vedas told us, that all this is not material. It seems to be. This is, one way of understanding the term Maya. It's that things are not what they appear to be. There's magic afoot, and the cosmic magician has fooled you into thinking these are material objects that are separate from one another. But here comes, the great yogis and the great scientists telling you, not so. You're being fooled.
Being fooled. There's fear associated with that, right?
That can be, yes.
Babaji, Sri Guru Babajii, is mentioned in his book, and there's a quote taken from it. Even a little practice of this Dharma will save you from great fear.
That's from the Bhagavad Gita.
Oh, yeah. Bhagavad Gita, right? So what does that mean? Fear from what? Knowing that this is reality, or not knowing that this reality is false. It is a dream, and everything that's associated with that. We really fall into that play and really take these characters like very seriously.
Here's one of the books I wrote was about the paradoxes of life on a spiritual path. This is one of them. It's all unreal in a certain way. As Yogananda used the cinema metaphor, that it's all just a play. Shakespeare said we're all characters, life is a drama and we're all players and so forth. So all this that we perceive through our senses and comprehend through our minds, it's all changing all the time. The reality is changing like the images on a movie screen. And we're not conscious of the light being projected from the source, the creator, you could say, that creates all these images. And if you take the metaphor a little further and say, well, we're also not conscious of the screen on which the images are being projected. Just as we're not conscious of, in normal states of awareness, of our own true nature. We're busy being engaged with the objects of the senses and the objects of the mind. But when those objects cease, like in deep meditation, when the mind settles down, what is revealed? What's revealed is our true nature, which is beyond the mind, beyond the senses, the true self, the movie screen, the screen on which it's all pronounced. So you could take that cinema metaphor to reveal the nature of the true self. What is the fear? We all have our own different fears. There's the fear of losing our body, the fear of physical pain, and of course the fear of death, the fear of losing a loved one, the fear of being poor, the fear of getting sick. We're filled with fear, and for good reason. We're living in the world where today's headlines can make you fearful. But a little of the Dharma, meaning a little of that experience of our own true nature, of the divine reality beyond all this mess, alleviates a lot of that fear because, for one thing, on a practical level, you realize that the source of happiness and contentment is inside you, and you can have that despite what's going on out there. That's one of the goals of yoga, as you put it earlier, living in the world and being a yogi. One of the results of having a path and being true to it is you maintain a certain amount of equanimity and peace and contentment, even in the midst of craziness and chaos. So you alleviate the ordinary fears because you have that contentment inside. And I think that's a lot of what it means. Even a little of that, a little taste of that, you can have that. You can have more of it. And if you buy the yogic notion of the true self, and that we survive on the soul level after death and come back in different bodies, then the fear of death changes. We're still human. We still have bodies. So, we have anxieties, and we'd rather not get in a car accident. So we stay on the right side of the road. You could say that's the result of fear, or you could say it's just the result of good common sense. And
do you think Yogananda feared death?
I don't think he feared death. I don't think he liked being in pain. He was ill at times, and the last few years of his life were difficult, and he was ailing, and no one likes pain. It's difficult to deal with, but I think he was advanced enough, certainly, to and people around him said that this was the case, that in those years when he was ailing and he knew he didn't have much more time to live, he always had that inner peace and radiance. And I've seen that in other people, who are not great gurus, but who just were evolved enough to be facing the reality of death with great dignity and poise and absence of fear. So that's, I don't know what it'll be like when I face death. And maybe I'll surprise myself and be terrified. But I don't think so. I think I don't fear death, and partly because I have a conviction that there's something more. What I fear, or what I get anxious about, is having to live in pain for a long time, or being losing my having a dementia of some sort. That is a real source of anxiety, but it's not fear of death.
Well, what does it mean to die before you die, right? Like, I've been hearing that a lot lately, right? And if
really
you conquer that, yeah, it's been popping up in like books or teachings or something similar to that, especially in the psychedelic world, where people were,
I see what you're getting at. I thought you meant like, living a deadened life.
no, like to die before you die, maybe like take the psychedelic and kind of surrender to the
yeah,
unknown.
there's a lot of research about that, but it goes back centuries. One of the things in Yogananda's life, this is one of the little things that are, I discovered that are in my biography of him, but not in his own, was I'm going to digress a moment here, and I'll just to say a few things about it. You know how some people are prodigies? Maybe you knew some in school and they were gifted at music or sports or something. Yogananda was a spiritual prodigy. He was a very charismatic young man and athletic, but he had this orientation to the life of the spirit and to the search for God consciousness as a child. And as an adolescent, he was what we call in the West a ringleader. He was a leader, but instead of like, let's go steal hubcaps or let's go to the concert or let's throw a party, he was taking his friends to see saints and to the temples. And he started a little ashram when he was a teenager. He was a spiritual leader, even as a child. And when his family moved around a lot until he was about 13. Every new place, he would stake out a little corner and have a sanctuary, even as a child, a place to meditate, a place to put his revered icons and do chanting and that sort of thing. So he was oriented that way. One of the things he did, he went to see every guru who came through Calcutta, every saint, including the person he writes about who's called the levitating saint. These became teachers and mentors of his, some of whom had great stature, some of whom no one ever heard of. But he learned from all of them. One of them was a tantric teacher who would take him to the cremation grounds in Calcutta to sit among, the ashes and the bones and watch the cremation, and gave him a skull to bring to his meditation room, or maybe it was his bedroom. There are traditional teachings that make you contemplate death as a spiritual practice.
Is that similar to Agori? Is that what that is like?
That's one of them. That there are extremes of that you don't want to have anything to do with. But the Tibetans would meditate, on where the bodies were taken for the, vultures and stuff. It's not uncommon that there are methods for contemplating death. Just so you get buried deep in your awareness that death is inevitable, death of this body, death of this personality is inevitable, but at the same time, you're experiencing that in you that is eternal and infinite, that surpasses death. So that was an incident in Yogananda's young life. His father saw the skull and did not like it, and made him stop seeing that teacher. But that was part of his studies, as it is for, in one form or another for many people. But what it really means to die before you die, when you, in deep meditation, when the fluctuate, as it says in the Yoga Sutras, the fluctuations of the mind cease, and there's pure silence, and your own true nature of, eternal, unchanging bliss consciousness is revealed to yourself, with the self revealing the self to itself, as they say. That's beyond death. That's getting in touch with the eternal in you. And in that sense, you're dying. And if you have that experience often enough, and you mentioned psychedelic research, they're doing this with terminally ill people. They're giving them a taste of the eternal beyond death. And meditation is that. And so in that sense, you're having these little deaths on the spiritual path, which presumably will make the real thing just an extension. Somebody put it to me this way recently. Every day you breathe in, you breathe out, you breathe in, you breathe out. One day you'll breathe in and you'll breathe out and you won't breathe in again. And so, in a sense, we're all doing that,
Absolutely. Rehearsing for death, right? Like,
Yes.
wow. That was pretty good. I like that. I didn't know that about Yogananda.
Well, there's a lot of things people don't know
Well,
about
tell me,
yoga.
right? Like, come on, give me some juice.
Okay,
Like,
here's some of the takeaways. When my book about him came out, I gave some talks called, Life Lessons from the Life of Yogananda. And some of them are just extremely practical about living life on the spiritual path. One of the things you don't know about, or people don't appreciate about Yogananda, is how hard he worked. You mentioned earlier that he chose a life of renunciation, but he had a mission. And he took that mission seriously. He was to bring these teachings to the West and reach people and make an impact. That's not easy. It's not easy now when we have podcasts. I have my podcast. I reach a certain number of people. It's called Spirit Matters. I had to sneak in that plug. So I could sit here by my microphone like you do and reach people. It wasn't like that in the 1920s. He had to work really hard. He had a radio show at some point, but that
really?
was the height of technology. Yeah, in Los Angeles. But it was short-lived. But for the most part, he was on railroad trains going from place to place and having, needing help, renting a hall to give a talk or doing it in people's living rooms, all, this stuff. It was hard work. And he did it, gathered slowly, as I chronicle in my book. He started out with a few people in someone's living room in Boston, outside Boston. And then it grew and people became students, and some people had money and they would rent a place and, for him to teach in, and it grew and grew and grew. And soon he was filling Symphony Hall and places like that. It took time. And then you have to have an organization. He hated organizations. He called them hornets' nests. But his guru, Sri Yukteswar, told him, yeah, you have to deal with human beings. You have to pay the rent. You have to do all these things if you want to reach people. So he put up with it. There were times, you see it in his letters, where he said, I'm done with this. This is, people are suing me, and people are disappointing me, and the people in my ashram are fighting with each other, and it's just too much. So I want to go back to India. Please, Divine Mother, relieve me of this task. Nope. Had to go back to work. And you see that in his letter. When he went to India for that 1 year, after traveling around the US for like 15 years, working hard, establishing an organization, doing all the things legally he had to do, getting ripped by the press, getting attacked by fundamentalists, all this stuff he had to endure. And just, anybody who's ever worked in an organization knows it's hard, even if you're a spiritual master. And it was the depression, hit, and they were just eating whatever vegetables they could grow on the land. But he survived through it all, and it was hard work. And there were times especially when he was in India, he said, I just want to stay here. I want to go, be with these yogis I'm seeing, just go off. Like you said, he ran off to the Himalayas, not once, not twice, but 3 or 4 times when he was a child, wanting to go to the Himalayas and be a yogi and find his guru, but it wasn't to be. He had a mission. And he had to deal with that. So it was hard work. And he did it with grace and dignity and skill. And, he was worried about money and the survival of his organization right up to the months before his death, trying to secure a solid financial foothold for its future. And, practically not begging, but imploring his disciples who had money to, bequeath some of it to secure the organization, writing like a maniac to get this book and other works finished before he passed. So, he worked hard. That's a lesson for all of us. If he had to work hard, if he had to deal with money, if he had to deal with personalities, if he had to deal with betrayal and, all that, then if we should not feel sorry for ourselves. It's, karma's karma, and you can do it in the midst of, like in the Bhagavad Gita, when Arjuna, the great warrior, has to go out and fight a war. He's told to first be a yogi, establish yourself in deeper, higher consciousness, and then go do what you have to do. And that's a big lesson. And, Yogan's he didn't write about all those difficulties to the extent he might have. He didn't write about the lawsuits that, and the accusations against him and all that. But I had to, and I had to research it and all that. And he also had, he had a childlike sense of humor and play. A lot of the people who wrote about him, who knew him, would talk about his tendency to play practical jokes on people, and to go to movies. Let's take a break. Let's go to see a movie. And in those days, in your 1930s or something, it might be a Western, cowboy movie, what we would call it, or a silly comedy. And he would do that. And he would, and he loved to cook and eat, and he, throw dinner parties for people. And he loved Christmas, and he loved to travel and sightsee and bring home souvenirs and gifts for people. Those are little things you learn about, and you say, we elevate people like Yogananda and put them on pedestals and make them godlike, but they're human. He had to scold people. He had practical concerns, for money and all the rest. And he got angry, and he had fun, and he, was playful, and he had his own personality, and he liked music, and he, all these little things that we're all so human, even as we're discovering our spiritual side. And one of the nice things about digging deep into the life of a spiritual master like him is you're reminded that we're also human. He was human, we're human. And that's not to be denied.
Sure. I can relate to that 100%. Like, just some of his struggles. I mean, imagine him coming over here to a country like the United States of America in the 20s or 30s, and being a foreigner from a foreign culture land, right? And
dark skinned.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And having to build his organization, and having, like, to your point, all that work of traveling the United States via train, and it taking a lot longer to get somewhere. And then when you get there, you're maybe not well received from the community that you're speaking to. And then having to portray the message of enlightenment or spirituality to a community that's already entrenched in Christianity, right? Like, having to break those stigmas that are associated with some of his teachings. Like, it's fascinating to me. Like, and so it places more meaning on those letters that you read. I'm sure you experienced that, like a kind of compassion for him.
Oh, my goodness, yes. I mean, one of the first thoughts that occurred to me, having grown up, I lived in New England for a few, years, and I'm back living in New England. He arrived in Boston in 1920 in September, and we all love fall in New England, but that would have been chilly for him. He's from Bengal. And I thought, wait a minute. He arrives in Boston. There's a presidential election going on. It's the first time women can vote. There's some serious racism in the country. The Ku Klux Klan was on the ascendancy in the early 20s. Irish people were being discriminated against, let alone African Americans. And here's a guy with dark skin, long hair, orange clothing, until he realized he could wear Western clothing and be a little disguised. And from a culture that, in most Americans' eyes, is a backward, primitive culture, being civilized by the British as part of the British Empire. Or if they were, liberal-minded, a poor, oppressed country being subjugated by a colonial power. People didn't necessarily think India had anything to teach us. That came later, in my youth. We fell in love with India and everything, and when the Beatles went there and so forth. But in his day, it was just a backward culture. Gandhi wasn't even very well known at that point. He would become well known. And so, but one of my first thoughts was, in a couple of months, it's going to be winter. Does he even have a coat? Well, so I actually looked up what the average temperature in Calcutta would be on Christmas Day as opposed to Boston. And there's like a 50 degree, 30, 40 degree difference in average temperature. And I thought, what was his first winter like? And he doesn't make mention of that. And I still don't know, but I can only imagine, someone said, hey, you need a coat.
What are you doing? Get a coat on,
you need
guy.
shoes. These sandals are not going to,
That's funny.
And so just even on that level, and walking the streets and being made fun of, there are always two kinds of Americans, and you see it in our culture today. And in researching the gurus who came here from India, before Yogananda, after Yogananda, Yogananda himself, they all face this. There are some people who see somebody who's different, who's of a different religion, of a different culture, a different skin color, and they feel threatened, and they retaliate, and sometimes with threats of violence, sometimes with legal things, immigration law and all that. Yogananda couldn't become a citizen, even though he lived here for 30 years. He finally became a citizen the last couple of years of his life because the laws changed. He was a subject of a British Empire. They were spying on him. This is another thing we don't know, people don't realize. But the British were keeping an eye on him. They were opening letters clandestinely that were coming to see who was he writing for. Is he one of these radicals who was trying to overthrow the empire? He spoke out. He spoke out in favor of Indian independence and for Gandhi. That was highly risky, but he did it. These are little things that we can take as role model sort of things. But he had to face all that from people who would see him as doing the work of the devil, or as a possible subversive, or somebody who might corrupt the morals of American women who were students of his. There was a big other Swamis faced that as well. And then there were the other people who were saying, who is this stranger? Oh, let us welcome him and let us hear what he has to teach us. And it was those people who paved the way for his, being able to do it. But there were always these two types of Americans, and he had to deal with the opposition, but at the same time was blessed to have, kind, loving, supportive people who helped him out, taught him the ways of, convinced him he had to advertise. That was one of the things. He didn't have to, well, no one's going to come to see you if you don't, put an ad in the paper. And what do we say we're teaching? And you could see how he adapts by looking at the title of the lectures that he gave, public lectures, in the newspaper ads. And you see him learning about life in America and saying, oh, Americans, will come and I'll tell them yogic practices, will help them in their business and help them in their marriages. They're pragmatic people. So you see, a learning process and an adaptation process. And it's kind of symbolic of how we all have to, adapt to changing times.
Sure. 100%. Oh, Phil, this has been amazing. I have to ask you one question, though. Last question, just because I'm so fascinated with it. Does he ever mention in his letters, like, about the Guru Babajii at all? Right?
Oh, sure. Well, I don't know about letters. I can't remember what he said publicly, what he wrote about, and what he said in letters. But Babaji, as you know, is the legendary guru who is said to never have aged, who is held to be the founder, the first guru in the lineage that Yogananda is part of. So it's Babaji and Lahiri Mahasya, who is anointed by Babaji to make these teachings available to more people, and becomes a legendary householder guru in Benares. It turns out to have been the guru of Yogananda's parents. And then Yogananda, when Yogananda meets his guru, Sri Yukteswar was also a disciple of Lahiri Mahasya. So that's the lineage: Babaji, Lahiri Mahasya, Sri Yukteswar, Yogananda. And then there's other teachers people don't know about who were also followers of Sri Yukteswar and Lahiri Mahasya, and they're teaching here and there in India and everything. So that's the lineage. Whether you believe Babaji, the stories about Babaji being this ageless, centuries-old guru who lives in the Himalayas, who appears every once in a while to people, special people, to give them teachings and elevate their consciousness and give them a mission to do. Whether you believe that's true or not, because there's many people who say, oh, yes, I met Babaji in the Himalayas and I'm now teaching who knows whether they're deluded or lying. We don't know. I mean, we have to be real about that. But Yogananda certainly made him a focal point of the origins of these teachings and of his own mission, and to the extent said to have met him. Whether Yogananda was deluded or it's all true, honestly, I can't say. I'm not at that level of where I can verify it or not, but I don't see why. I don't think it requires too much cynicism. Why not is my feeling. Maybe it's true.
Sure.
Why wouldn't it be?
Why not?
But I also met people who claim to be Babaji. So, we have to bear in mind that not everything said about Babaji is necessarily true. But I think in Yogananda's case, it's all being transmitted with sincerity.
Sure. Phil, this has been awesome. Thank you so much for taking the time. I really enjoyed this conversation about Yogananda and hearing your story and how it impacted your life. And seeing one of the original copies, not original, but
no, it's not
one of the copies, earlier copies of Yogananda's autobiography. So, Phil, thank you. How can people reach out to you? How can they find your stuff?
Oh, I'm Philip with one L. philipgoldberg.com is my website. My podcast, as I said, is Spirit Matters. My books are online. I would not just recommend my Yogananda book, but my others. And you can reach me through my website.
Awesome. Phil, this has been awesome. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you, Trey. It's been a pleasure.